Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to Congress in Context. So we're diving into another edition of the Congressional Record today. And, this time you sent us this material and we're going to sort of extract the most important and interesting stuff from it. I guess you could say our mission today is to help you navigate this really complex document. And we're hoping to highlight the key debates, legislative actions, and overarching trends that are really kind of shaping our government right now. So think of this as your shortcut to understanding what's going on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, absolutely. This particular edition of the Congressional Record is interesting because it really showcases the wide array of issues that Congress is tackling right now. We're seeing, everything from those kind of solemn acknowledgments of remarkable individuals to, some pretty heated debates on energy policy and even just the sustainability of those really crucial social programs that a lot of people depend on. And then, on top of that, we'll also be delving into, ongoing discussions about national security and, the way education is evolving. And then, a whole bunch of other legislative activities that when you kind of zoom out and look at them together, it really provides this sort of panoramic view of our current political landscape.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's start with how Congress is choosing to remember and honor service.
Mm-hmm.
And one moment that really stood out was the tribute to North Carolina State Senator Marshall Arthur Rauch, who lived to the impressive age of 102. I mean, that is quite a life. And from the sounds of it, his impact was really deeply felt.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Mr. Moore of North Carolina, he spoke about Senator Rauch with just a lot of warmth, and he really emphasized his lifelong dedication to public service and his impactful leadership and his profound generosity. I think what's really significant here is that we're talking about tangible change, at the local level. His efforts in, peacefully integrating schools in Gaston County, that wasn't just a policy decision, It had a direct impact on the lives of so many students, and it really opened up opportunities that otherwise might not have been there. So it's a powerful reminder of how leadership at the state level can create those ripples of meaningful change that affect people's everyday lives.
And it wasn't just about his policy achievements, was it? There was also a personal connection that added kind of another dimension to the tribute.
Right. Yeah, Mr. Moore actually shared that he had known Senator Rauch from his time as a Senate page. And, that personal anecdote really kind of brought Senator Rauch to life. I mean, it wasn't just highlighting his accomplishments, but it gave us a glimpse into his character, his kindness and his wit and this unwavering belief in public service that stayed with him right up until the very end of his very long life.
And so from honoring a lifetime of service, we shift to recognizing extraordinary acts of bravery. With the commemoration of National Medal of Honor Day on March 25th, this is a day that really carries a lot of weight in American history.
Absolutely. Mr. Thompson of Pennsylvania really underscored, I think, the immense heroism and selflessness that's really embodied by every single Medal of Honor recipient. I mean, this is the nation's highest military award for valor. He also provided some historical context, reminding everyone that the first Medals of Honor were actually presented on March 25th, 1863, during the Civil War. And it's actually quite humbling to think that since then, 3,547 individuals have received this incredible honor. And, that official designation of March 25th as National Medal of Honor Day back in 1990, it ensures that those sacrifices, they continue to be remembered and valued by all of us.
And it seems like Pennsylvania in particular has a very strong connection to this recognition.
They do, yeah. Mr. Thompson pointed out that 380 Medal of Honor recipients have called Pennsylvania home, which, that's a remarkable number. He went on to share the stories of two of those Pennsylvanian heroes, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Buddy Bucha and Private First Class Foster Sayers.
Foster Sayers' story in particular, it really kind of grabbed me. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, of course. So during World War II, Private First Class Sayers, he was just 20 years old at the time. And as an infantryman, he showed incredible courage in France. He was actually alone when he charged multiple enemy positions, and he did this intentionally to draw their fire away from his unit. This incredibly brave act ultimately allowed his unit to capture that enemy stronghold. And, for his actions, he received the Medal of Honor. And his bravery continues to be honored in his hometown of Knox, Pennsylvania, where the post office is actually named after him. Mr. Thompson also shared a really touching personal connection, mentioning that Sayre's wife used to be his babysitter. And I think that just illustrates, how these acts of extraordinary heroism, they often come from within our own communities, sometimes from the most unexpected places.
So we've talked about a lifetime of service and then incredible acts of bravery. But the Congressional Record also took time to honor Lieutenant Commander Greg Cowan.
Yes, exactly. And this was, a more contemporary recognition. It was honoring his, dedication and leadership and commitment to the U.S. Navy. I think all of these tributes really highlight the different ways that Congress acknowledges and values public service and sacrifice, both in the past and in the present.
So let's move on to something that's, I think, sparking a lot of discussion and maybe even some anxiety for a lot of people out there. And that is the challenges facing the Social Security Administration. Now, this section of the Congressional Record, it actually referenced a Wall Street Journal report, and it also brought up some comments from Elon Musk. So that kind of caught my eye.
Yeah, what's interesting here is how a news report combined with, some public statements from someone like Elon Musk, a high-profile figure, can really shape the entire conversation around a vital government agency. So, the record indicates that this discussion, it actually originated from that Wall Street Journal article and an interview that Elon Musk gave to FOX News. And in that interview, he reportedly outlined a goal of cutting $800 to $900 billion from the Social Security system. It sounds like that could potentially happen through benefit reductions.
And, all of this discussion is happening at a time when the demands on the system are actually increasing.
Right. Exactly. The Congressional Record points out a pretty concerning trend in staffing. So back in 2010, there were 68,000 employees, and they were serving 54 million beneficiaries. But today, that number of beneficiaries has gone up to 73 million, and yet the agency is actually aiming for a smaller workforce than they had back in 2010. So, the fundamental worry is that we'll have fewer staff who are already stretched really thin. They'll be stretched even thinner trying to serve this growing number of retirees and other individuals who rely on Social Security.
And we also heard about some really immediate changes that are being made that could have a huge impact on beneficiaries.
Yeah, there are a few changes that are raising some serious concerns. One is that, reportedly, within just a week of this Congressional Record entry, the agency planned to completely discontinue phone service for beneficiaries who are trying to either provide or even just update their bank information, which is a standard security measure to prevent fraud. On top of that, in-person appointments are also expected to become less available. Like a really stark example of that is the planned closure of the White Plains, New York office, which means that individuals who need that in-person assistance, they're going to be forced to travel all the way to New Haven, Connecticut, which is about a 2-hour drive. And, for many elderly or disabled individuals, that kind of travel is a huge burden.
It sounds like it would be incredibly difficult for people who really depend on that face-to-face support. And on top of everything else, it seems like the agency's technology is also really struggling.
Absolutely. The record mentions that the Social Security Administration's website, it's actually crashed multiple times because the servers just get completely overloaded. And that effectively cuts off access for millions of users. And then to add to those challenges, they've also reportedly eliminated the entire office that was responsible for monitoring the customer experience. So at a time when the system is clearly under a lot of strain, I think it seems like a pretty counterintuitive move to reduce the oversight of how user-friendly the system is,
Then we got the nomination of Frank Bisignano to be the permanent commissioner. It sounds like that's become a real point of contention.
Yeah, it has. Senate Democrats, they've raised some pretty significant concerns about Mr. Bisignano's professional background. And specifically, they're pointing to his track record of leading companies that then went through major downsizing and cost-cutting measures. And the record actually details some pretty concerning allegations that suggest if he were to be appointed, it could potentially lead to widespread closures of both regional and field offices, up to 60%. And on top of that, the layoff of something like 7,000 employees. So, I mean, the potential consequences for the millions of Americans who rely on Social Security are pretty alarming. There are projections the disability claim wait times could increase to as long as 3 years, and phone wait times could go way beyond 2 hours.
There were also some new administrative requirements that were mentioned, which those could create additional hurdles for people.
Absolutely. So there's a new rule that now requires all legal immigrants and newly naturalized citizens to apply for or update their Social Security cards in person. And this is actually a shift from how things used to be, where cards were often mailed automatically. And so you combine that new rule with reports of, completely overwhelmed phone lines and increased foot traffic at those local offices, where, by the way, the staff may not even have adequate training on all of these new procedures. And it really paints this picture of a system that's just struggling to keep up with everything. And even basic office supplies are reportedly becoming scarce because of a spending freeze.
I mean, it just sounds like the employees within the agency, they must be feeling the strain of all of this.
They are. I mean, another contributing factor to this whole situation is that return to office mandate, which reportedly has led to, frustrating parking shortages and a decrease in morale among the employees. And then, kind of on a darker note, there are reports of scammers who are taking advantage of this situation by sending out phishing emails that are designed to, prey on beneficiaries' anxieties. And then to add to all of that, Senator Brooks recently acknowledged that there's a lot of uncertainty about potential benefit cuts. And this came up during a town hall meeting that she held near the Social Security headquarters. I think all of that really underscores the level of concern about the future of the agency.
It's definitely a bit of a worrying picture for people who depend on Social Security. So let's shift gears now to another important debate that was highlighted in the record, and that's energy efficiency standards. Specifically, the House considered a joint resolution, H.J. Ray's 75. Can you remind us what the purpose of this resolution was?
Sure. So this joint resolution, it sought to completely overturn a rule that had been established by the Department of Energy. And this rule set new energy conservation standards for commercial refrigerators, freezers, and those combination refrigerator-freezer units. And it looks like this rule was published in January of this year, 2025. But what I think is particularly interesting here is how starkly divided the arguments are for and against this resolution. And the division largely seems to fall along party lines.
Right. So let's start with the arguments that were made in favor of repealing these new standards. What were some of the key points?
Okay, so Representatives Goldman of Texas and LaMalfa, they were really vocal in their support of the repeal. Their argument was that these new standards, they just put an unnecessary burden on businesses. They lead to more bureaucratic red tape and potentially even compromise food safety. They also expressed some concerns about the financial impact. They estimated the cost of these standards at around $8 billion. And their worry is that ultimately that cost is going to get passed along to consumers. And they really framed this resolution as an effort to roll back what they called, quote unquote, senseless and unending bureaucratic red tape, which they attributed to the previous administration. And I think this also speaks to a larger concern that they have about government overreach, especially when it comes to regulating everyday appliances.
And so on the other side of the aisle, what were the main arguments against repealing those energy efficiency standards?
Well, the opposition, and this included some unidentified Democrats and Representative Pallone, they focused on the potential cost savings for businesses if these standards were kept in place. And they estimated those savings could be pretty substantial, something like $4.6 billion over the next 30 years. They also pointed out that a good chunk of the commercial refrigeration products that are available right now, something like 2/3, they already meet those new standards. And for those that don't, any upgrades that would be needed would have a fairly short payback period of about 3.5 years. And they really criticized Republicans, saying that they were focused on what they called an anti-efficiency agenda and that they weren't paying enough attention to more urgent issues. Their argument was that by repealing these standards, you're actually going to drive up energy costs for both businesses and consumers in the long run. And they also made a really important distinction, which is that these standards apply specifically to commercial appliances. So we're not talking about the refrigerators that people have in their homes.
So to step back a little bit, what was the Department of Energy's justification for putting these updated energy efficiency standards in place to begin with?
So the Department of Energy, they stated that these standards are actually required under existing law, which mandates that they regularly assess and improve the energy efficiency and cost effectiveness of all sorts of different appliances. They also emphasized that the development of these particular standards involved a lot of consultation and collaboration. They engaged with a whole range of stakeholders, including manufacturers in the industry. So it wasn't just something they came up with on their own.
So it sounds like there's this ongoing tension between wanting to reduce the burden of regulations and the potential benefits, both for businesses and the environment, of, higher energy efficiency standards. So let's shift our attention now to a discussion that really centers around national security and the integrity of our academic institutions.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting here is this growing concern about potential vulnerabilities that can arise from, financial ties between foreign governments and American universities. And the Congressional Record specifically mentions concerns about the Chinese Communist Party, and how they might be capitalizing on what some perceive as loopholes in the Higher Education Act to exert their influence.
And so has this concern led to any proposed legislation aimed at addressing those potential risks?
It has. So Representative Baumgartner of Washington, he introduced something called the DETERRENT Act, which stands for, get ready for this, it's a long one, Defending Education and Trust by Ending Rogue Regimes Engaging in Nefarious Transactions. And so this bill, it seeks to, really beef up the reporting requirements for foreign gifts and contracts that are received by colleges and universities. Some of the key provisions of the bill include, really lowering that threshold for mandatory reporting to just $50,000. And for financial interactions with countries and entities that are considered to be, of concern from a national security perspective, there's even a $0 reporting threshold. So, any amount, no matter how small, has to be reported. And the bill also aims to increase transparency in a couple of other ways. It would require universities to disclose any foreign funding that individual faculty members are receiving, and it would also force them to reveal any foreign investments that are held within the endowments of private institutions. So the thinking here is that, greater transparency is really essential if we want to protect both academic freedom and national security from, potentially concerning foreign financial influence.
Now, border security is always a top priority for Congress. And there were some pretty strong claims made in the Congressional Record about recent trends at the border.
Right. So Mr. Mann of Kansas, he asserted that there has been a really substantial decline in illegal border crossings at the southern border. And he says this has happened since President Trump took office. He specifically pointed to February of 2025 as having the lowest number of recorded crossings ever. And to back up that claim, he cited figures indicating a 94% decrease compared to February of last year, 2024, and a 96% reduction from what he described as the Biden administration's peak. He also highlighted a really dramatic 98.8% decrease in apprehensions within the Del Rio sector when you compare it to those peak levels during the Biden administration.
Those are some really big numbers if they're accurate. And there was also an announcement about the construction of a border wall, right?
That's right. So Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, she announced that the Department of Homeland Security is going to resume construction of that border wall that was, a major initiative of President Trump's previous administration. And this decision really underlines, I think, how much emphasis continues to be placed on those physical barriers as, a key part of the overall border security strategy.
The Congressional Record also addressed some pretty sensitive social issues, and that included the introduction of something called the Do No Harm Act. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So this act was introduced by Mr. Ender, and it aims to protect children from what he describes as experimental and unethical practices associated with what's often called gender-affirming care. And in his remarks, he drew some comparisons to bans or very strict limitations on these types of practices, limitations that are already in place in several European countries. He also stated that this bill builds on a previous executive order that was issued by President Trump on the same issue.
There was also a call for the resignation of Pete Hegseth, and this was tied to national security concerns. What were the specific allegations being made?
So Mr. Vindman, he's the one who called for Pete Hegseth's resignation, and he cited what he called a really egregious breach of national security. The allegation is that Mr. Hegseth prematurely disclosed the specific launch and strike times for a really sensitive military mission. And Mr. Vindman, he's got 25 years of experience in the Army, and he was also a former National Security Council staff advisor. So he really emphasized how highly classified this type of information is and the very real danger that it could pose to the lives of pilots if it were to be disclosed prematurely.
All right, so let's turn our attention now to fiscal policy. Budget reconciliation was another big topic of discussion in the Congressional Record. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So Mr. Lamalfa, he stated that Congress is moving forward with the budget reconciliation process to try and address what he called reckless spending. And their goals are to strengthen the economy, cut down on government waste, and really prioritize the interests of taxpayers. Mr. Moore of Utah, he elaborated a bit more on this, and he highlighted what he described as, a bipartisan effort in putting together this reconciliation package. And some of the key objectives he outlined were things like implementing pro-growth and pro-family tax policies, securing the nation's borders, strengthening economic growth, supporting domestic energy production, promoting international peace, and also making government operations more efficient. He also really stressed that they want to avoid going back to what he called antiquated international tax policies, and instead they want to build on what they see as the successes of those 2017 tax reforms, while also acknowledging that, federal revenue as a percentage of GDP, that stayed pretty much the same after those 2017 tax cuts, while government spending actually went up. So I think for you, the listener, what's important to understand about budget reconciliation is that it's a pretty powerful legislative tool because it allows certain types of fiscal legislation to pass in the Senate with just a simple majority vote. So they can bypass that usual 60-vote threshold that's often needed to overcome a filibuster.
The Congressional Record also took time to recognize Women's History Month, and several members highlight the contributions and progress of women.
Absolutely. Miss Presley of Massachusetts, she paid tribute to Alfreda Harris for her, her incredible community building work and her dedication to supporting young people in Boston, and particularly her long involvement with the Boston Parks Department. Miss Schulten of Michigan, she kind of took a broader view, and she reflected on the progress that women have made over the past 250 years since the founding of the nation. And she noted that there's increased representation in Congress, higher college graduation rates, a rise in women-owned businesses, and more women in leadership positions across a whole range of sectors. And she rightly pointed out that this progress is a direct result of the tireless work and sacrifices of those earlier generations of women who fought so hard for greater equality and opportunity. She also highlighted some notable women in the history of the U.S. Naval Academy, including Midshipman First Class Sidney Barber, who made history as the first African-American female brigade commander.
But it wasn't all just celebration. There were some critical perspectives that were shared as well, right?
There were, yes. So there was criticism directed at what was described as the administration's, unrelenting and reckless attack on those narratives of persistence, diversity, and opportunity. And Mrs. Schulten also really emphasized the importance of protecting essential social safety net programs like Medicaid. And she shared a really powerful personal story about Abby Koroma, who is a mother of two visually impaired daughters in her district who depend on Medicaid for those vital healthcare services. And I think that anecdote really brings home the point that these policy decisions, they have very real consequences for individuals and families in our communities.
So shifting gears a bit, there was a really interesting discussion about the education of young people and, the whole concept of American identity. Mr. Grothman of Wisconsin had some observations that I thought were worth unpacking.
Yeah, Mr. Grothman, he shared his thoughts on what he sees as the success of some specific minority groups in America. He mentioned Ahmadiyya Muslims and the Hikmon community, and he suggested that part of their success stems from not subscribing to what he calls a DEI ideology. And he believes that this ideology falsely suggests that non-European individuals, they inherently face an uphill battle in America because of prejudice. And then to counter claims of xenophobia, he highlighted the really large number of individuals who've actually become naturalized U.S. citizens just in the past year, which is around 850,000. And then he pivoted to express some concerns about what he sees as a weakness in American families compared to immigrant families. And he suggested that our current welfare system might actually be creating disincentives for mothers and fathers to stay together. He cited programs like food assistance, Medicaid, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and Pell Grants as examples of policies that he thinks might contribute to this. And he went on to kind of draw a connection between what he sees as a decline in the traditional nuclear family and the influence of, those radical feminist ideas from the 1960s and their offshoots. And he argued that that societal shift is linked to problems like crime and drug use. And so he advocated for getting rid of what he calls marriage penalties in welfare programs. And I think, ultimately, Mr. Grothman's point was that we need to educate young people about the successes that various diverse groups have achieved in America, while also making them aware of the potential downsides of those government policies that, he believes may weaken the traditional nuclear family structure.
And finally, the Congressional Record covered just a whole slew of other recognitions and legislative actions, which really highlights just how broad the scope of issues is that Congress deals with on a daily basis.
Exactly. So we saw congratulations be extended to the R.C. Hatch boys basketball team in Uniontown, Alabama, for winning their state title. And there was a warm welcome extended to the city of Birmingham, Alabama, for hosting the NCAA Women's Basketball Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games. The Gold Apple Boutique in Fayette, Missouri, got a shout-out as the 4th Congressional District's Small Business of the Month. Seaside Police Department Chief Nick Borges was commended for his work in solving a particularly tough case. And of course, they formally approved the journal from the previous day's proceedings, they recited the Pledge of Allegiance, and there was a general leave granted to members so that they could revise and extend their remarks in the record.
And there's a lot going on in the Senate as well, addressing a bunch of different issues.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Senate passed a bipartisan resolution that was led by Mr. Grassley, recognizing March as Blood Clot Awareness Month. And they really emphasized how serious this health issue is for a lot of Americans. Mr. Schumer, he voiced some serious concerns about what could be a major breach of military intelligence. And he also expressed his opposition to the confirmation of Aaron Reitz for the position of Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Policy. And he cited concerns about Mr. Reitz's views on, defying federal court orders. And then we had Mr. Blumenthal. He sounded the alarm about what he called a crisis for our veterans. And he attributed this to cuts and filings that are happening within the Veterans Administration. And he specifically pointed to Elon Musk and former President Trump for these issues. And he cited some pretty specific numbers on, VA employees who have reportedly been fired, and the number of open positions that are just sitting there unfilled, and also the potential impact on a VA hospital in South Dakota that could lose a significant portion of its staff. And then he shared some really moving personal stories about veterans and employees who've been negatively impacted by all of this. And so they actually held a roll call vote in the Senate on a motion to just end the debate on Mr. Reitz's nomination. Mr. Blumenthal also spoke out against the nomination of Michael Falkender for the position of Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And his concern was about potential Medicaid cuts that might be implemented to, free up money for tax cuts. Mr. Van Hollen, he spoke against overturning a rule from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that put a cap on overdraft fees. And so they held another roll call vote in the Senate on a motion to disapprove of that rule. Mr. Cornyn, he stood up for Elon Musk, defending his efforts to find and eliminate waste and fraud in government spending. And he strongly condemned those recent acts of vandalism that took place at a Tesla dealership. Mr. Tillis, he expressed his appreciation for the work of the outgoing Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. And the Senate, they confirmed Michael Falkender as the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and they did that with a roll call vote.
It also sounds like the conversation about energy and environmental policy in the Senate was pretty lively.
Oh, it was. Mr. Whitehouse, he led this discussion, and he was joined by several of his colleagues. And they were very critical of the Trump administration's policies on energy and the environment. And specifically, they were concerned about those rollbacks of clean air and water protections, like the Good Neighbor Plan. And they also mentioned the reported firings of EPA staff. They even went so far as to allege economic sabotage, and they disputed some claims that Secretary Wright had made about renewable energy. And their argument was that the administration was putting the profits of big oil companies ahead of, public health and the well-being of our planet. And they also expressed some worries about the increasing frequency of these climate-related disasters that we've been seeing and the rising cost of insurance in those areas that are being hit hardest. And then there were a ton of Senate bills and resolutions that were introduced covering all sorts of topics, everything from, how the media covers federal court proceedings to ways to improve the VA Office of Patient Advocacy. And there were studies being proposed related to a recreational trail in Utah and even changes to the boundary of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And then there were proposals to treat those expenses for physical activity as medical care and to expand the use of E-Verify. And the Senate also passed a bunch of resolutions recognizing all sorts of commemorative months and weeks. Things like Music in Our Schools Month and Asbestos Awareness Week, as well as some resolutions that acknowledged the independence of Greece and the important contributions of Native American women. And then on top of all of that, there were notifications about arms sales that were going to be made to Qatar, tributes to some individuals who were retiring from leadership roles in national organizations, and announcements about upcoming Senate committee meetings.
So as you can see, this latest edition of the Congressional Record, it really gives us this amazing in-depth view of all of the different issues that are being discussed and debated in Congress. From recognizing those who've served our country to tackling these complex and often controversial policy decisions that affect our economy, our social programs, and our national security. These official proceedings, they provide us with such valuable insights into how our government works and all of the forces that are shaping our nation's future.
I completely agree. We really hope that this deep dive into the congressional record has shed some light on some of these key developments, maybe even sparked your curiosity to explore these important topics even further. I know the congressional record can seem a little intimidating and overwhelming at first. There's so much information packed in there, but it's such an essential resource if you want to understand where our national policies come from and what direction our government is heading in.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, I'm curious, what stood out to you the most from our conversation today? And what questions do you have about, where our public policies are headed and the overall governance of our nation? We really encourage you to stay informed and to stay engaged by digging deeper into these issues that we've discussed. And thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the congressional record.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to break down these complex topics.
Until next time.